We are going to be reading from Hebrews 10, chapter 10, verses 19 through 39. A little different than what's in the bulletin, I believe. But Hebrews 10, verses 19 through 39. Whenever I get to do the reading, I always like to do some backstory research on it. A great tool if you're ever interested in looking into a book of the Bible. Even as we're reading it here at church, go to YouTube and do a search for Bible Project. It's a really great resource. They illustrate as they're explaining, and they break down the topics of chapters and things to make it a little more understandable. Especially, a lot of the Bible is written in different, not perspectives, but different purposes. Like, some of it is poetry. I don't know how to interpret poetry correctly. So they give you some good backstory on how to use the understanding that it's poetry to interpret things. So we're getting into Hebrews 10. Hebrews 10 is a letter to the Hebrews. There's not like solid confirmation on who the author is, but a lot of people lean towards Paul. The person who's writing it knows Jewish history really, really well. Knows all the sections, and in this letter uses sections of Jewish history to make his case for why people should be worshiping Jesus, and if they are a believer, a Jewish Christian, to truly be going all out for Jesus. The audience at this time was being persecuted for their belief, and this letter was to encourage them to stand firm. So chapters 1 and 2, Jesus is compared to angels, sort of the supernatural, and the Torah. In the Old Testament, it is taught how angels are messengers. We know that, right? The angels went out and they told people what was going to happen. You could also hear the voice of the Lord, or you could see Jesus himself, a lot of people believe, as he approached people. And it says, if angels' messages are important, how much more important was Jesus' message at that time? So sort of a comparison. You believe those messengers, why not even more so believe in what Jesus had to say? Because Jesus is God's word. Chapters 3 through 4, Jesus is compared to Moses in the Promised Land. So Moses was the leader of the Jewish people for a time. The Jewish people were rejecting the message that Moses was giving them, and therefore they were no longer permitted to enter into the Promised Land. They weren't allowed to go in because of their actions and their beliefs. So if the people rejected Moses' message, how much more worse off are they and we if we reject Jesus' message? So once again, a comparison. You're rejecting Moses, and yeah, although he was big in stature in Jewish history, but Jesus even more so, and Jesus is our hope for a new creation. The Jewish people wanted to go to the Promised Land. They weren't allowed to. That was their new creation that they were trying to get to, but they weren't permitted to because of their decisions. Chapters 5 through 7, Jesus is compared to priests, and specifically Melchizedek. The priests led the Jewish people, but they themselves were flawed. The priests had to offer a sacrifice for their sins before they could do sacrifices for others. Something more was needed, and Jesus was the ultimate priest king. He was the ultimate. To reject Jesus was the only option to be reconciled to God. So now that Jesus came, he is our eternal priest. He is our high priest. He is our intercessor. And so if you're rejecting the priests, how much more if you're rejecting what Jesus has to say? And lastly, and this is what we're going to get into chapter 10 here, chapters 8 through 10 says, Jesus' death was the ultimate sacrifice. Sacrifices previously needed to be sacrificed on both a daily and a yearly basis. Jesus' sacrifice is final and permanent. To reject Jesus is to turn your back on the offer of forgiveness, as Jesus is the perfect sacrifice. So it was neat to read through and listen through Hebrews and watch a little video on this that shared a lot of these details. And I'd encourage you to do it because you can get even more. It goes into Melchizedek a little bit more and the importance of that. But now let's get into Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19 through 39 with all that backstory. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain that is through his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as it is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much worse punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he has sanctified and has outraged the Spirit of grace? I want to read that one again because it's kind of deep. How much more worse punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he has sanctified and has outraged the Spirit of grace? It's not a good outcome. For we know him who said, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," and again, "The Lord will judge his people." It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living. But recall the former days when, after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partnered with those so treated. For you had compassion to those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that yourselves had a better position and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay, but my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve our souls. What a cool reading. Pastor Steve.
Thank you, Chris. In so many sports or in so many struggles, there is a point at which somebody wants to quit or they're thinking of quitting. And what I want to say today is, in those quitting times is when it needs instead to be a turning point. I remember when I was a kid, we lived in Colombia, South America, but there were still a lot of sporting events that we were able to see or to hear. And I remember as a kid going to neighbors' houses, and those were the days of some of the glory days of boxing. You know, that was the glory days of Muhammad Ali, George Foreman before he started selling grills. It was the glory days of Joe Frazier. And I remember as a kid and watching in black and white, watching some of these boxing tournaments. And there would be times when it seemed like the guy was done. The guy was finished. And they would go to the corner. And you couldn't hear what was going on in the corner. But sometimes you wondered if they wasn't saying, "I'm done. This is it. I'm done." And yet they would get back out there. And sometimes that was the turning point. It seemed like they were, that's what we talk about when somebody's on the ropes. Why do we say that they're on the ropes? Because the ropes are the only thing that are holding them up. And yet they get them back out there. Now, we know the bad effects of boxing today. I'm not denying that. But this was a time when the glory days of boxing, and it was like you thought it was over. And then they would get back out there, and within a matter of moments, it would be the turning point. People who run, they have the term of hitting a wall. And it's when the runner has gone for however long and has that urge and that feeling like, I can't go anymore. But runners know that if you push through that point, you actually catch your second wind and you are able to keep going on, and many times that is the turning point. Instead of it being a quitting point, is a turning point. I remember also when I was a kid, I hate to admit this, is this on tape? When I was a kid, we would listen to Armed Forces radio, and our family was Dallas Cowboy fans at the time. Oh. And I remember this particular game. This was the day of Roger Staubach. The Cowboys were down 2 touchdowns, and there was only 2 minutes left. And we had friends that were also Dallas Cowboy fans, and when the score was that bad, they turned the radio off because they were so discouraged and so upset. But we kept the radio on, and then at the end we called them because the Cowboys and Roger Staubach in 2 minutes came back and won. And they were like, ah! Sometimes it seems as if the church and Satan may have the church on the ropes. I mean, the world and Satan has the church on the ropes. The writer of Hebrews is writing to some people. Some of them are on the ropes. Some of them are realizing that they're reaching that point where it's either a quitting point or it's got to be a turning point. Chris has talked about some of the background of Hebrews. I want to just add a couple more things. Family and friends in the book of Hebrews were telling these people, get over this Jesus phase. You have gone to this Jesus thing, and it's now time to come back into the fold. It's time to come back to Judaism. It's time to come back to the temple. And this Jesus phase is just going nowhere. It's getting you persecution. Some of you are losing your jobs. And we're ready to welcome you back, but you got to give up Jesus to do it. Could that not be some of what sometimes we are facing as believers? Is it worth it? Is it worth it to be known as a believer? Or is it easier right now to go along to get along? Do you know what that phrase means? That means we're not going to give up Jesus, but we're not going to give up that we believe in Jesus. We're not going to give up at work we're not going to give out the fact that we believe in Jesus. We're not going to give out the fact that we don't believe in homosexuality, that is an equal thing. We don't believe that abortion is a right. We don't believe these things. So are we going to go along to get along, or are we able to speak up and say, no, I believe something different because the Bible and Jesus and God tell me something different? The writer of Hebrews here gives them 3 statements. And they are statements that are to put steel in their backbone and to give them the opportunity to take what would be normally a quitting point and turn it into a turning point. I'd like you to open it. I'm not going to treat it in depth, but I'd like to show you how he takes them point by point and says, guys, it is not time to quit. It's time to push through, and the Lord is able to make you stand. And for those who quit, for those who give up, it's a really bad option. Turn to Hebrews chapter 10. He says, the 3 phrases that we're going to look at is where he says, let us draw near. That's in verse 22. In verse 23, let us hold fast. And in verse 24, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. He is then going to say to them, those who deliberately go on sinning, he says, those people who see this as a quitting point, it has serious consequences. And then he's going to come back in the end, and he's going to tell them that it is now time to push ahead and to complete. Do not throw away. Verse 35. Do not throw away your confidence. First of all, I wanted you to notice that the first thing that he tells us is that pushing forward and moving forward is not something that we do on our own. It's something that Jesus has already done. Please notice, therefore, brothers, we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that Jesus opened for us through the curtain, talking about the curtain that separated the Holy of Holies. Remember when Jesus died, what happened to that curtain? Whoosh. It was a symbol of the fact that the way had been totally opened. Let us draw near. And here's the thing. He is comparing there the reticence that the high priest or anybody would have had to go into the presence of God. Nobody was allowed in the Holy of Holies but once a year, and even the high priest, as he went in, was very concerned of whether he would, as he was going in, whether the offering that was offered for himself and the offering for the people, whether it would be accepted by God. And the picture here is a picture of those who are standing on the verge of going into God's presence, and they're like, we're petrified. Do you remember when God appeared on Mount Sinai and the people heard the thunder and the lightning and they weren't allowed to get near the mountain? If anything got near the mountain, it was supposed to be shot with an arrow, and there was this fear. We cannot go into the presence of a holy God, and truly man should have that fear. We are sinful people. But he says when Jesus came, Jesus blazed that trail right through the holy place of the temple, right past the altar, because he had made the sacrifice, and he opened the curtain and he said, come on in. He says, don't stand on the verge of God's presence. He is welcoming us to go into his presence. Notice what it says here, though. Let us draw near with a true heart. How do we have true hearts? I thought the Bible said that our hearts are desperately wicked. Well, when Jesus gives us that new heart, he gives us a true heart. A true heart in full assurance of faith, our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water, clean both on the outside and the end. Even baptism helps symbolize that. We need to have a baptism this year. I don't care, right? Exactly. But here's what he's saying. Listen, we don't have to stand on the verge like they did, because remember, this is where their family was telling them that they needed to go back to. You need to go back to the temple. You need to go back to the Old Testament. You need to stand on the verge of the temple. You can't go into the Holy of Holies. And he's saying, no, listen, Jesus has blazed the trail that leads right into the presence of God. And we need to enter in. Don't stand on the verge, enter in. It's interesting that the phrase that talks about a sprinkled heart and a sprinkled and a cleansed conscience is what we call the perfect tense. In other words, Jesus has done it and the effects of it continue. We are not those. See, they had to offer all those sacrifices, and they weren't allowed in there but once a year, and it had to be repeated over and over and over again. And he's saying when Jesus does something, it's good. It's good. This is not the time of a quitting point. This is not the time of a quitting point. This is the time to push on in. Listen, Jesus is the one. This is not the quitting point, it's a turning point. It is not the time to slip back into the all familiar, but it is time to follow the one who has blazed a trail right into the presence of the holy God. It is not the time to hesitate, but it is the time to push forward. The writer of Hebrews says, stop hanging out on the verge of meeting with a holy God when he has invited you to come out into his presence, to ask for help in time of need, to seek his presence. We have the high priest Jesus. Jesus goes in with us, right? In fact, Jesus stands there interceding for us. Don't hold back on the verge. Move on in. Secondly, he says, let us hold fast to our confession of hope. Verse 23, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. Here we're looking at the fact that there is a hope that is given us in Jesus Christ, that it tells us later, or flip back to chapter 6, verse 19. The hope that we have in Jesus is a hope that is secured by his sacrifice. It's a hope that tells us that God is for us, not against us. It's a hope that says that we are able to be in relationship with him. And in chapter 6, verse 19, notice what it says about this hope. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain. Isn't that what we just talked about? It's a hope that comes because we are related and in the presence of God. And he says inwardly it is to act as an anchor of the soul. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. Outwardly, it needs to be that which we are able to present to the world and say, this is our hope. This is my God. This is my security. This is my assurance. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. I can face tomorrow. I can face uncertainty. And the confession is not only an inward confession that acts as the anchor of the soul, but it is the confession that I am ready to make to the one who asks of the hope that I have within me. You see, for these people to make a confession and to hold to that confession meant they were ostracized by their family. Oftentimes they were persecuted by their community. And so there was the tendency not only to be shaken inside, but there was the tendency to keep their mouths shut and to slowly go back to the old ways. This is not a time for us to be silent. It is really a time. Turn to that passage, 1 Peter 3, because I want you to see the context there. Let me pick it up at verse 13. Now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts, honor Christ as Lord, as holy. Okay, so he's saying, look, don't let fear reign in your hearts. In your hearts, hold Jesus Christ as holy. Let Jesus' holiness and his presence reign there, not your fear of man. See, the context for making this confession is not a context of I stand up in front of a stadium and it's a special occasion. There's a bunch of Christians there and I give a public testimony. The context here is of the pressures of society, a hostile group surrounding you, and they're saying, why in the world would you want Jesus? Don't you know that if you would just deny Jesus, all this persecution, all this looking at you with funny eyes, all this denouncing you would go away? And the Christian says, no, Jesus Christ, fear of man does not rule in my heart. Jesus Christ as Lord rules in my heart. And then it says, and your hearts honor Jesus Christ as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason that you have hope. At that point, those persecutors and those people surrounding you want you to realize you have no hope. You're going nowhere. And you know what we say? Hope doesn't come from the situation. It doesn't come from you. It doesn't come from your approval. It doesn't come from whether you're going to persecute me or not. The hope that reigns in my heart comes from Jesus Christ. Let us hold fast to our confession. Why do we hold true to our confession? Because the one who makes his promises to us always holds true to his promises. Turn back to Hebrews chapter 10. And here is one that is so important. See, entering in is our confidence that we have towards God. Holding fast to our confession is the confidence that we're able to display to the world around us because of what God has done in our hearts. But then here's an important part. We're not in this alone. We're not to be in this alone. God did not call the Christian to be a lone ranger. He called us to be in community. He called us to be in community with each other and in community with Him. And He says this, verse 24, let us consider, here's the thing. Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting meeting together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as we see the day approaching. This idea of let us consider how to stir up means this is not just something that I kind of like think it might be a nice idea once in a while to be helpful to other Christians. No, it means that I study the situation. I study what's happening in our church. I study what's happening in our society. I study what's happening in your family, and I find ways to encourage you, and you find ways to encourage me. It's a purposeful thing. We need this now. We need this now. You know, people's minds today are sometimes hither and yon. Sometimes people even have a hard time thinking today, right? I meet with a group of guys and we talk about that sometimes because it seems like our minds are like on what's happening in the politics, what's happening in this, what's happening in that. And God's like, let's bring this back to focus. How can we stir up one another to love and good works? And the word there for stir is a strong word. It's not like we come alongside and, pat each other on the back. Oh, how you doing? Oh, yeah, it's been so hard. Oh, yeah, I'm having such a hard time. No, this is like, hey, brother, what are we going to do about serving the Lord even in these times? Hey, sister, what can we do to forward the gospel? It's the idea of stirring up, and it's the idea of almost like putting a burr under the saddle. But you do it in love. It's not like you slam people. You do it in love. And we're stirring up one another to love and good works. Why? Because those are the trademarks of the believer. Jesus said, all men will know that you are my disciples when you love one another. We stir one another to love. I'll tell you this, it's better be done in a loving way, because when you stir people up, they better know that you're loving them, because otherwise they'll be not too happy. He says we need to stir up one another to love and good works. Why good works? Because the Bible tells us in Ephesians 2 that we're saved by grace, but we're saved to do works that God has set forth for us. The work of the church and the work of the believer doesn't go on hold because the rest of the world and our country has told us to put everything on hold. The gospel message still goes forward. The mission of the church still goes forward. Do we have to sit down and put our minds to it? Absolutely. But we don't just put it off. We don't just put it in lockdown. Paul says, I'm in prison, but the gospel's not in lockdown. When I'm in prison, I start witnessing to the guards, and they're probably back there saying, oh man, it's my day to be with Paul. I just know what we're going to talk about. It's that Jesus and that whole gospel thing. Man, when I am chained to him, I actually tried to act like I'm asleep. I don't know what they said, but I know this, a number of them got saved. Because Paul didn't say, oh dear, I'm in lockdown, the gospel's in lockdown. He said, no, the gospel goes forward, and I find ways to be involved. You see, we can't do this alone. That's why we need each other. Love can only be expressed when we're together, in whatever way we can do that. Good works are best carried out when we do it together. Turn to Acts chapter 2. Remember the church couldn't wait. They get saved, and they can't wait to be together and to do things together. Look at Acts chapter 2, verse 42. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship. What do you think that was? They got together, but they didn't get together around the Super Bowl. They got together around the gospel. They got together around Jesus, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. And awe came on every soul, and many signs and wonders were being done, and all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as needed. And day by day they were attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes. You see, there was the times when they were together in the bigger area, and there were times when they were together where? In their homes. They received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people, and the Lord added to their number. There were more people to get together. Day by day, those who were being saved. Do you know why the writer of Hebrews is emphasizing this? Because there were some that had already left. And they had left because they had listened to those that were telling them, it's time for this Jesus phase and this religious phase to be over. You need to be back with your own people. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, no. This is not a quitting point. This is a time that those who truly know the gospel are together. In 1 John, it says that there had been some who had left them, and it says they went out from us that it might be seen that they were not of us. You see, the book of Hebrews is written to a group of people, and some of them have already left because, see, they thought that they were believers, and for a while it looked like they were believers, but the pressures of society, the pressures of their family said, man, I'm ditching this. I'm going back to what I knew from long time ago. I'm going back to where I'm accepted and stuff like that. I'm done with this persecution stuff. I'm done with the pressures. I'm going back to where it's easy. And he's saying, listen, don't do that. There was also some that were hanging in the balance. They had been a part of the fellowship. They had even enjoyed the things of the fellowship, but they were still wavering because it was starting to cost something. And they were like, I don't know, am I going to hang in here? Some of them had become believers, but they were very young in their faith. Some of them had never quite come to faith, and they were hanging in that balance. And the question is this a quitting point or a turning point? Not neglecting meeting together as a habit of some is, you see, some of them, it just became too easy. But encouraging one another. Why? And all the more as we see the day approaching. You see, there's two things about the day approaching. The day approaching, we realize that our ultimate accountability, even though this verse talks about our accountability to each other, the ultimate accountability that we're going to face one day is before God. The other reason it talks about it because of the day that is approaching is because we have limited time. As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good even to one another, especially those that are of the household of faith. I'm going to summarize these next two because I want to get us out of here. But I do want to say this. The next verses say, and he was talking to that group, the group that had already left and the group that was on the fence, and he was saying, don't do it. Okay? Don't do it. For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, look, you've been in our midst, you've heard the things of God, You've been to some of our fellowships. You've tasted of what God is and what He has promised. There no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. If you're going to turn at this point, it's very likely that you will no longer hear His voice. Echoes of chapters 2 and 4. Your heart will become hardened, and there will not be a sacrifice of sin for you because you've left what you had the opportunity to embrace. But if fearful, you've turned your back on what should have been, could have been yours as far as forgiveness and the acceptance of God. And here's what is left: a fearful expectation of judgment, of the fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. Anyone who set aside, and then he warns them. They were tempted to go back to the Jewish faith. They were tempted to go back to Judaism. And he's saying, listen, even the law taught that those who don't follow God's law get punished. What about when God offers His grace and you turn it aside? Anyone who set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much worse the punishment will be deserved by those who trample underfoot the Son of God. Wow, that is really strong language. People that hear the gospel message, that get so close and yet turn away, He's saying, you're just stepping all over Jesus. And who profane the blood of the covenant by which He was sanctified, and have outraged the Spirit of grace. And God says, vengeance is mine. God will bring the judgment on those who have been so close and yet have turned away. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And then this passage is so important, especially to us today, because now he comes back to those that he's addressing about hanging in there. This is not a quitting point. This is a turning point. Recall the former days. After you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, sometimes being partners with those who were treated thus. For you had compassion on those in prisons, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. I want to summarize this, and maybe someday we'll get back to it. He says, listen, you can't turn back. You've already experienced a deeper fellowship. You've already experienced increased compassion, where you were willing to be in prison with those, or as if you were in prison as those that were in prison. You've already demonstrated that you have resilience. You joyfully accepted the confiscating of your property. And you have already shown that you have greater priorities. Here's the thing. The church has been through times of difficulty and struggle before. There has been no time in history where there haven't been problems and challenges to the church in each succeeding generation. For a time period, many times they have had a very easy time. Even one where the gospel was popular or there had been revivals. But then there came times of great persecution. The church, our brothers and sisters in Christ today face these words. Those who are in prison, those who are having their properties confiscated, those who are in sufferings and struggles, those who are being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction. And you know what? They're not turning back. And so in verses 36 through 39, he says, it's not time to turn back, it's time to press on. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. It's not a quitting point. You've hit the wall. It's time to push on by the grace of Jesus Christ. He's the one who's already blazed the way. It's not the time to question our confession of faith. It's time to confess it again with greater determination, greater conviction. It's not the time to neglect being together. It's the time to find ways to be together. And in that being together, to push forward the mission that we're here for, the gospel of Jesus Christ. What's cool is how this leads into chapter 11. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. Because then he goes into this whole explanation of people who left tremendous things behind to go forward with only the promise of God, because they believed more strongly in the promise of God by faith than they believed in what they had in their hand already. Abraham, Moses, on and on and on. Whatever is in your hand is not worth whatever's in the bush. No, let me... No, I got to reverse that. Whatever is in your hand is worthless because of what God has in his hand that is by faith. This is not a quitting point for churches. It is not a time to say, not only are we on the ropes, but it's time to tap out. This is the time to let us consider how we might stir up one another to love and good works. And part of that is finding ways that we can be together and do these things together. Will it take thinking? Yeah, that's what the Bible tells us. But it doesn't ultimately depend on us. It depends on the power of the gospel, and it depends on the love of Jesus Christ. And we are those who do not shrink back, but we are those who what? Press forward. Help us, O Lord. Thank you that others have already demonstrated that not only is this possible, but there is great strength provided and great reward for doing so. Amen.